Welcome to the Whiskey Vault. I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School. We are going to talk about sherry barrels because everybody likes to talk about their sherry barrels. For reference, there's some really good content on the website whiskeypedia.com talking about this, but several others have noted the same kinds of things, and I'm doing sort of a synopsis of my reading and discussions with friends. Distilleries, blenders love to talk about sherry barrels. And then they love to quote all the research on what sherry is and what Oloroso is and what Pedro is. But what you are mostly drinking when you drink sherry casked whiskey is probably not what you think it is. Now, are they lying about it? No, not technically. But are you getting what you would expect from reading the literature? Probably not. So, first, in the sherry industry, sherry, like champagne, comes from a specific region in Spain. And without being in that specific region, it can't be sherry. Now, it can be the same grape, the same production process, and the same general flavor direction, just like there can be champagne-like products that are not in Champagne, France. And there are regions in Spain, just outside of the sherry designation, that make what any general consumer would drink and consider to be a sherry. But specifically, sherry comes from one area. And when you're aging sherry, you are using typically what's considered to be a kind of Solera barrel cask, which basically means that and it's not this simple, but say you've got 3 rows of barrels and you fill the bottom one and then it starts aging. And then you fill the next one and it ages. And then you fill the top one and it ages. And you've got 4-year-old, 3-year-old, and 2-year-old sherry in there. Well, you will take sherry out of the 4-year-old to bottle, and then you will fill from the 3 to the 4 and from the 2 to the 3, and then you'll refill the gap with new sherry or 1-year-old sherry. And you will keep doing that so that as you age things, you're always bringing in elements of that older older sherry, and you're also creating a flavor consistency across the various releases. Now, that's called the Solera cask version. Some of the Solera casks in the bottom of these Solera, in these bodegas, are 100 to 200 years old. That's a sherry cask, not just that bottom layer, but barrels that have held sherry for decades and decades. Those are sherry barrels. Now, there is not enough sherry consumed in the world to provide the level of truly aged sherry barrels needed for the Scottish, Irish, and American whiskey industry. I mean, we're talking like some of your big brand, single distillery big brands in Scotland could go through 25,000 sherry barrels to fill in a year, right? There is not 25,000 barrels of sherry being consumed, and that's just for one distillery. So how are they pulling this off? Historically, I mean old school, like 1800s, 19th century, sherry was put in barrels and then shipped to the UK, and then they would dump that, bottle it, or sell it, and then refill that barrel because they had it. And that was a real sherry barrel. And then there was this growth in need of barrels, but not an equivalent growth in sherry barrels. And around the same time, new oak, late 1800s, early 1900s through to the end of Prohibition, early 1940s, new oak starts coming from America, from bourbon barrels coming out of America, needing to use new oak and then having all these used casks. And there becomes a market in the UK for like, holy crap, we can get all of those barrels way cheaper. And they were seasoned with a spirit, which is what we're putting into it. That's great. And you see this transition in the early 1900s to a dominantly bourbon barrel cask as far as volume goes. And around that same time, you also see scale go up on distilleries. And what often happens at that point is that you start to see distilleries do what's called seasoning, sherry barrel seasoning. And they don't talk about this, but they will take a product that could be a sherry, an Oloroso or a Pedro, and they'll put it in a barrel, and they'll put it in there for a year, maybe 2.5, 3 years at most, and then it gets dumped, and that barrel gets sent to Scotland, and that's a sherry barrel. Now, is that like 100-year-old bodega Solera cat? Nope, that's just a barrel that had a first fill of a year to 3-year-old sherry and then sent to Scotland to put whiskey in it. And then that sherry will sometimes go into another barrel and season it for a year to 3. And you can do that until you feel like you're not getting what you want from that sherry, and then it gets turned into vinegar. So the vast majority of the sherry going into these whiskey barrels for seasoning don't end up in bottles of sherry, they end up in bottles of vinegar. And not only that, a not small percentage of the sherry barrels that are being seasoned are not actually coming from the sherry region, designated region for sherry in Spain. They're coming from other bodegas outside, sometimes Spanish bodegas, but not in the sherry designated region. And they're being referred to as, quote, sherry barrels, which is something the Scottish Whisky Association would never let happen if it was going in reverse. I do know that from talking or reading one and actually having conversations with Compass Box, that they used to designate sherry versus sherry style with an uppercase and lowercase s. And your mileage may vary on that kind of thing. So what does that mean for us, and should that outrage you? I don't know. But first, let's drink Sherry Cask Chivas 13-year extra aged. It's just extra. Chivas extra aged 13-year-old blended Scotch. This is the Sherry Cask selection. Now, bodega level sherry casks, probably more like seasoned sherry casks, but we don't actually know. Let's see. I just saw this on the shelf and thought, I haven't done Chivas in a while. It's definitely more fruity. And it was definitely blended to push forward that sherry cask impact, the things that sherry would provide to a whiskey. It's a little figgy, a little jammy, a bit of a malt funk kind of grain forward, a soft vanilla and cream. Drinks, way sweeter. Woo! Okay. So if that's blended for the sweetness of a sherry cask, it is achieving it, but it's almost like it's doubled down on the vanillins so that the sweet berry notes are actually riding on an undercurrent of dense vanilla. And it gives it this berries and cream kind of direction instead of just a pure like sherry funk, right? Now, in case you're hearing voices coming in the background, they are downstairs. There's a group downstairs in the dining room at the tower right now that is judging for the Texas Whiskey Festival. And you may be hearing them in the background. Nothing I can do about that. Our schedules overlapped. Okay. As far as blends go, I actually like the normal Chivas 12. It's got a little more funk and a little more character to it. This is a little too sweet for me. A little too soft. But, you know, it's fine. It's a decent blend. I always think Chivas does a great job of just a classic, decent blend. Is it Sandy? Is it Highslip? Is the master blender for Chivas? I've always liked, in the blends, I always enjoy Chivas. Now owned by Pernod. Yeah, mostly candy. They're definitely doubling down on the sherry fruitiness. Soft and sweet, lots of vanilla. Okay, so here's why I don't know if the outrage is well placed. Because this isn't totally new. Historically, in the 1800s, when sherry barrels were sent to Scotland and the UK, they were also not the Solera level barrels. The sherry bodegas are not going to give up their oldest barrels and just be like, there you go. So even then, often the barrels that were being used to transport sherry for commerce were also what you would consider to be kind of a seasoned cask. So that's actually not that new. And at the same time, a really cool thing is that the rise of craft single malt in America and the need for sherry casks in America and the ability to only need a dozen barrels instead of 10,000 barrels means that there are quite a few American craft distilleries who have been able to get their hands on decommissioned Solera level casks, including Balcones. These are over 100-year-old Solera level barrels. And from talking with the people who've done that, they have filled these things 1, 2, 3, 4 times and are still getting this massive sherry influence from the deep wood sherry-soaked staves. So it's a choice. And actually now you have a better chance as a whiskey drinker of actually trying Solera level sherry cask influenced whiskey than ever before. Is it going to come from brands of the size of Chivas? Probably not. You might be able to find some influence of them in distilleries where you get like, maybe Aberlour or Glendronach. But even then what you'll likely get is some of those heavier impacts blended with some of the more seasoned casks. And, but again, this is not a new thing. This is not like for all of history, we only got true Solera cask. And now in recent modern history, we're getting robbed. That's not how it works. And with seasoned casks, you get a little bit more control over the impact of the sherry on your final blends. So it's not always a bad thing. A true Solera level barrel dominates the whiskey. So much that I've had some of those first fill, and they almost taste more like a whiskey-influenced sherry than they do like a sherry-influenced whiskey. But I do think we should be advocating for more transparency about cask seasoning. So like, for example, no one in the barrel industry has a problem saying this is toasted and this is charred and here's what that means. No one in the barrel industry says, hey, this is kiln dried, this is air dried. Well, some are lying about it, but generally they'll tell you these are air dried, these are kiln dried barrels, and here's what that means. I think that they should be switching from saying true sherry cask whiskey to a sherry seasoned barrels or something like that. Now, is it ever going to happen? Also, I think there should be a little more transparency about when the sherry style of barrels that you're getting are not actually from the true sherry region. But is it going to happen? No. Why? Because only people like you and I give a and the general consumer market doesn't care. They just like what they drink, and that's fine. And because there's no massive drive for that level of transparency, we're probably never going to see any large brands motivated to do it. So, meh. You know now. Don't use it to be a jerk. Don't use this information to go up to someone's table at a pour in a whiskey event and be like, are your sherry casks actual sherry, or are you just seasoning your barrels? Please don't be that person. Just, Anyway, I hope that was helpful to you. Cheers, and I'm really glad you're here. Don't be the jerk who goes and lectures people about sherry barrels, but do be the jerk that likes and subscribes to the Whiskey Vault.